So hello everyone and welcome to our I-CBT Friday discussion group. We're a group of clinicians who meet regularly on Fridays to share information about learning I-CBT, expand awareness, and healthy discussion. So thank you so much for being here and being part of this. I'm Mary Hosbrough, one of the co-facilitators for these discussions, along with Margaret McCall and Sylvie Levine. And over the summer, we've been having open discussions and peer consultations during this Friday time, which have been really valuable. So thank you to everyone who came and participated in those all summer long. And we will continue to have, one or two of the Friday meetings be in that more open and flexible format, because that really has been valuable, and we want to make sure we continue with those when we can as well. But today we'll also be returning to having presentation on special topics. So if you would like to see past presentations we've done on special topics or presentations on each of the I-CBT modules, you can find those recordings on the I-CBT.online webpage or on the YouTube channel. And once we get started, I will drop links for those into the chat. And today we're going to welcome Bronwyn Shroyer to speak with us about using I-CBT when OCD and PTSD are co-occurring. So in a moment, Bronwyn will introduce herself, and we ask that you hold questions until the end. And when Bronwyn's ready, she'll invite you to raise your hand and unmute to ask questions. Or if you need to put questions in the chat, for any reason, that's fine too. And I or Sylvie or Margaret will try to monitor the chat and bring those in at the question time at the end. Bronwyn said this is a robust presentation, so there might not be a lot of time for questions. If it turns out that we don't get to all the questions, when we do share a link to this, you can post some questions there as well. So please be mindful that we are recording. So don't share any client-specific information or details which might lead to a client being identified if you're asking questions. For specific case questions, Bronwyn does offer individual and group consultation for OCD and PTSD cases. So I will also drop a link for her information if you'd like to schedule consultations in the chat once she gets started as well. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the floor over to Bronwyn. Thank you so much.
Hey, everybody. Let me get my screen going. And my voice is a little iffy today because allergies have infiltrated Indiana in the form of ragweed. So we're going to hope my voice holds up. Okay. So I am Bronwyn Shroyer. I am an LCSW who owns a private practice specializing in treatment of co-occurring OCD and PTSD. A good portion of my caseload happens to be this particular presentation, although I do see clients for solely PTSD and solely for OCD as well. I'm also a co-founder of the OCD training school, and as Mary said, I provide training and consultation there, training on I-CBT, consultation on this particular topic and OCD cases in general. And I am super excited to share this topic with you because it's near and dear to me. And because it is near and dear to me, as Mary said, I told her it was a kind of a robust presentation. I have so much to say, but since we're limited on time, I've condensed this down from a wider presentation, wider training I'm doing for OCD training school. I'm hoping it's going to fit this audience the best that I could in this limited bit of time. So I'm hoping you're going to walk away today with a little bit more knowledge and maybe an interest in having multiple tools in your toolbox so that you can help this particular group of sufferers. So here are some learning points. I'm going to go over some of the basics of PTSD and then introduce some of the ways that the framework of I-CBT sets us up to hear possible active trauma responses. And then finally, I'll share some clinical observations of how trauma responses can impede OCD treatment. But an important note for anyone who is watching this now or once it's recorded and up on icbt.online and you're new to I-CBT, I'm not stating that I-CBT is a treatment modality for trauma. I-CBT is a treatment modality for inferential confusion, and you will need to have a trauma modality or multiple to address the trauma in these co-occurring presentations. So with that said, though, I have found I-CBT to be uniquely wonderful to use when working with OCD and co-occurring PTSD due to what we're going to discuss today. So if you stumbled into this talk accidentally and didn't know I-CBT exists or don't know the research behind it, please check out the vast list of peer-reviewed studies on Dr. Frederick Artema's website, icbt.online. So if you don't have a trauma modality and want to learn one, I just wanted to quickly list some of the most evidence-based treatments for PTSD and trauma. So I'm an EMDR consultant in training, this close to my approved consultant status, and I'm a certified EMDR therapist. So I tend to use EMDR in parts work, often in my own work, but I think the research stands totally supportive of prolonged exposure and cognitive processing therapy. And I'm super intrigued and impressed by the research that's coming out around written exposure therapy, which is done over 5 sessions. So I highly encourage all of you to learn an evidence-based trauma treatment if you haven't already done so. Okay, so let's dive in. We're going to dive into PTSD. And PTSD gets thrown around a lot in social media and therapy circles. And so I want to do a bit of psychoed here to make sure that we all know what we're talking about in regards to definitions. Because when it comes to research, we have to look at specific criteria to know whether or not we're looking at PTSD. And I personally happen to have a particular point of contention clinically with the DSM-5 criteria, which we'll talk about here in a minute. But when we look at research, it's important that we have an anchor point with a specific definition so that research can give us accurate information. So the definition is the common thread that gives research meaning. So let's take a look at that criteria for PTSD. PTSD has 8 criteria according to the DSM-5. The first one is about the stressor itself. So in order for someone to get a PTSD diagnosis, there has to be exposure to any of the following: death, threatened death, actual or threatened serious injury, or actual or threatened sexual violence. And this can be done through direct exposure, witnessing the traumatic event. So direct exposure is happening to you, witnessing the traumatic event, learning it happened to a close relative or friend, and then as part of your work duties. So for example, first responders. So you can see this is a limiting criteria. It only allows for very specific events. If a client does not meet this criteria, they do not meet eligibility for PTSD, no matter how much their functioning is impacted or if they meet all of the other criteria we're going to go over. The next criteria is about the intrusive nature of the event. So the client needs to express one or more of the following. The intrusive material can arise through unwanted or upsetting memories or through flashbacks where they feel like they're reliving the event in the current moment. PTSD can impact sleep in the form of nightmares about the event, and there can be emotional or physical distress after the exposure to the traumatic reminders happen, and they can get very activated within their body as well. So you've got this physical activity, reactivity after exposure to the traumatic events. So the key here is that these are unwanted intrusions. So does that remind anyone of anything? Let's take a look at that intrusive nature component. And we're going to look at the DSM criteria around the intrusiveness stuff with PTSD and OCD side by side. So PTSD has upsetting memories that intrude back in. OCD has thoughts, urges, and images that are unwanted. And these unwanted thoughts and images feel intrusive and cause anxiety or distress. And we know that in OCD, these thoughts are not just random. So they're not random intrusive thoughts when we're looking at OCD through an inference-based therapy lens. What we're instead looking at is doubts that are created through the obsessional reasoning process. And in PTSD, they're not random either, but associated with the traumatic event itself. So even though it isn't pointed out specifically in the DSM-5 criteria, OCD can also bring on physical reactivity as well. So some of your clients with OCD may report that when they're in the bubble, they're experiencing sweating, heart racing, pounding, stomach dropping, muscles tensing, and other physical reactions in response to the material of their obsessional doubts or the act of having to do their compulsions. You could see how a trauma therapist who doesn't know much about OCD could get confused. And this is probably part of why people go so long without a proper diagnosis for OCD. OCD can get confused for trauma, generalized anxiety disorder, a whole host of other things. And as someone with lived experience of OCD, I can tell you when I was in the bubble, I felt extreme physical distress doing some of my compulsions. It felt like I was going to seriously like explode out of my body. The amount of tension and just I don't even know what to say, terrible feelings in my body. And I hated doing my compulsions. And the images and the thoughts I would get could cause me some incredibly significant emotional distress. So, for example, if you were in my head for a little while when my OCD was not subclinical, you could imagine you're going about your day and are suddenly propelled into a story complete with imagery that you are going to somehow accidentally cause the death of those you love most in the world. Or your obsessional reasoning process is causing you to believe that your loved ones are in danger and the only person to keep them safe is you. And you have to do it in this magical way. And that was my life for a really long, long time. And as you can guess, the level of physical and emotional distress was intense at times, which also mimics what it looks like when we're having emotional and physical distress associated with PTSD. But this isn't to say that PTSD and OCD are the same thing. They're absolutely different phenomenon. And it is very important that everyone involved in the treatment of either diagnosis knows that their symptoms can look similar on the surface, so it can be tricky. And it is important that you help your clients learn how to tell when their symptoms are due to their PTSD or due to their OCD so that they can access the correct treatment, but also skills that they've been taught in treatment so they can resolve their pain in that moment. And as clinicians, we all need to be aware that not all material that looks intrusive is going to be OCD all the time, because PTSD also has this nature. And as clinicians who use I-CBT, you have a very amazing tool at your fingertips for helping you figure out if something is OCD or if it is something else. I-CBT is super helpful with this because we are looking at the obsessional reasoning process. This is what we're treating when we're using I-CBT. It helps us zero in on how the obsessional doubt is getting created in the first place in the case of OCD. That is going to help you with differential diagnosis here. If it isn't getting created through obsessional reasoning, then it won't be OCD. So let's go back to the criteria. Next up is avoidance. In this criteria, the client is attempting to avoid any thought or feeling about the traumatic event. They don't want to relive it, or they are attempting to avoid remembering it. And it isn't stated in the criteria here, it is later on. But I would also add that individuals with PTSD may also avoid situations that could lead to the repeat of the stressor. And as we all know, avoidance isn't just a PTSD thing. We see it all the time in OCD. And PTSD, the sufferer is trying to get away from anything that reminds them of what happened. They do not want to relive the event. The DSM-5 doesn't actually mention avoidance as part of OCD, which I find interesting. But essentially, in OCD, we're trying to avoid all of this, the OCD sequence. The sufferer doesn't want to get triggered because it will start this whole sequence off. And if they do get triggered, they'd love to avoid the doubt, which is why things like neutralization happen. And they for sure want to avoid the consequences of the doubt coming true, hence why compulsions exist, right? Since compulsions are seen by the sufferer as protective and can keep those imagined bad things at bay. Sufferers also don't want to feel the anxiety the doubts create. No one loves that feeling. So getting pulled into the bubble is worth avoiding for that alone. And doing compulsions is hell. So they want to avoid having to do them if they can, by staying away from the trigger to begin with. So compulsions can be exhausting. And I know in my own experience, I would do some amazing feats just to not encounter a trigger specifically so I wouldn't get caught up into my compulsions because I loathed doing them so much. So there are many aspects of avoidance within OCD, but the difference will be that in PTSD, the person will try to avoid anything linked to the event or that will make them think of the event. It is specific. It can also come up in avoiding situations that would allow the event to repeat itself. In OCD, we're avoiding anything that is going to pull us into a present or future-focused imagined nightmare, which comes about due to that obsessional reasoning process. Everything with OCD comes back to how the doubt was created. It is a confusion between reality and an imagined possibility without direct sense data to support it within the current context. So avoidance can be found with both conditions. Your job is to help your client notice if the avoidance is due to PTSD or to OCD. Continuing on with PTSD diagnostic criteria, 2 of the following must be present to meet criteria D, which has to do with negative alterations in cognitions and mood. So PTSD sufferers may not recall aspects of the traumatic event, or they could have cognitions of toxic shame about the self or thoughts about the world being dangerous as a whole. Sometimes there's exaggerated and erroneous blaming of the self or others for what happened, ongoing fear, horror, anger, guilt, or shame, losing interest in things that previously brought joy, feeling isolated from others, and lack of being able to feel positive feelings. Those are all possible and can look like depression. So let's back up for a second, though, to the second and third ones right here. So anyone else here distrust of the self there? So hang on to that info because we're going to come back to it. But you can see PTSD is also causing this distrust of the self. So PTSD sufferers must also meet 2 of the following under alteration in arousal and reactivity criteria. So increased irritability or aggression, engaging in uncharacteristic or increased risky or destructive behavior. I find that a lot of people with OCD laugh at this one because they're like, I don't do anything that's going to put me at risk of anything. But for some people with PTSD, this definitely is a criteria. Hypervigilance, we're going to come back to that one in a moment because being hypervigilant about possibility of something happening, again, is an interesting spot in co-occurring OCD. And then we have heightened startle reactions and difficulties with concentration and sleeping. And the remaining criteria are all about duration of symptoms, impact on functioning, and exclusionary factors, which are present in lots of DSM things, right? So criteria B through E must be met for at least a month for PTSD diagnosis to be given. Otherwise, if those criteria are getting met, it's a little bit different, but acute stress disorder is something you could look at. Half of those with acute stress disorder will go on to meet criteria for PTSD. It's just a slightly different diagnostic there. Symptoms will impact functioning, so school, work, social life, and the symptoms are not due to substance use, another illness, or medications. So we've gone over what goes into PTSD diagnosis as defined by the DSM. It's very specific criteria, and as I said at the beginning, this is important for researchers so that findings can have meaning across studies. But if you've been around the trauma community for a while, you know that criteria A, the stressor one, brings on lots of feelings from lots of people, myself included. This is the point of contention I mentioned earlier. As a reminder, in order for a person to meet PTSD criteria, the sufferer must have direct exposure or witness actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. And those are the only things that are going to fit criteria A. But here's the definition of trauma from the APA's online dictionary of psychiatry. Any disturbing experience that results in significant fear, helplessness, dissociation, confusion, or other disruptive feelings intense enough to have a long-lasting negative effect on a person's attitudes, behavior, and other aspects of functioning. This definition gives some more wiggle room for defining what constitutes a traumatic event, but not all people who encounter a traumatic event will develop PTSD or even acute stress disorder, which, like I said, mimics PTSD but lasts in a shorter time frame. It's going to last between 3 days and a month. So in fact, some people encounter traumatic events and do not have impairment to functioning or other aspects of what we would consider to be trauma responses. In other words, and this is important, traumatic events don't always equal active trauma responses. The event itself isn't what makes something traumatic. It is the individual's response to that event that matters. So trauma is also not about having a bad moment in time or a bad day. It isn't about every slight we face in life. Life can be tough and people can be mean and cruel and things don't go our way, but that doesn't mean that every negative thing that happens to us is a traumatic event. Sometimes it is just an annoying, unpleasant, frustrating event. So trauma events are going to bring on long-lasting negative effects that affect functioning. But the word gets thrown around too easily, which waters its significance down for those who are really dealing with trauma. And this is similar to those phrases we have all heard muttered about OCD, such as, I'm so OCD, or I'm a little OCD, and we want that to stop. So I'm also saying we need to do the same thing with trauma. It's a big deal. It's painful and it intrudes on life. It is not because the store ran out of something you wanted, or your friend didn't compliment your shirt, or you didn't get picked for a job, or your flight got delayed. Those are inconveniences, but they're not going to be trauma. So these definitions matter. With that said, though, there is room to argue, and this was my contention, that criteria A is too restrictive. Here are just a handful of experiences that wouldn't meet criteria A of the DSM for PTSD. But that doesn't mean your clients won't meet all of the other criteria or score high on a trauma screen. And this is important to keep in mind as you do this work with OCD, because 25% of people with OCD will meet criteria for PTSD at some point. But there are even more that could have these types of events in their history and may have an equivalent trauma reaction going on that would meet all of the other PTSD criteria outside of criteria A. Or perhaps they won't meet all of the criteria, but they could be highly elevated in some areas which are impacting their quality of life. So let's look at the intersection of OCD and PTSD symptoms. We've talked about avoidance and intrusive feeling nature of PTSD and OCD already. And as a reminder, people with PTSD will avoid reminders of the traumatic event. People with OCD are avoiding any aspect of that OCD sequence. If they can avoid their triggers, then they feel they can safeguard against all of the rest of the events that unfold once the obsessional reasoning process kicks off. PTSD and OCD can both feel intrusive, but none of it is random. With PTSD, the intrusiveness will line back to the event. With OCD, it will be due to the obsessional reasoning process creating a doubt. In both cases, it's unwanted and distressing. There is also an aspect of repetitive behaviors. When you see ritualized behavior as an OCD specialist, it makes sense to link it to OCD, but it might not always be the case. It could be generalized anxiety, but it also could be something like trauma. So there could be an active response going on. Sometimes people with trauma histories will want to guarantee safety or gain distance from the traumatic event. Someone may take multiple showers a day after a sexual assault, for example, or another person may have a ritual to decrease the potential for another car accident, or a robbery victim may check doors or windows each night. And someone who found out their partner has lied for 7 months and hid a double life due to infidelity may feel the need to check devices or ask for reassurance due to their reality being shattered. So your first job in working with people with OCD and PTSD is to help them uncover, well, when you uncover an active trauma reaction, it's to match those symptoms. You've got to match the symptoms to the appropriate diagnosis so you can adjust the treatment accordingly. One thing that can happen is that something can start as a trauma response, so locking the doors at night to guard against another robbery, for example, and then become an obsessional doubt. So now we have two things going on at once, an active trauma response, and then OCD coming in and adding on to that process. In the PTSD response, the person is guarding against a repeat of the threat by locking the door each night. This would be done just one time. It's just going to lock the door and be done, not repetitively. In comparison, OCD comes in and now has the person doubting their senses about whether the door is truly locked, which may involve multiple checks or rumination or asking for reassurance. So you see where it can start as one thing and morph into another. Okay, so now for what everybody in this crowd is really interested in. And so as I go through the rest of this presentation, I'm going to use the term trauma to include those events that meet criteria A of PTSD, but I'm also going to be including adverse life events that lead to PTSD-like reactions. I'm not going to be talking about minor inconvenience, frustration, or a bad moment, but anything that looks like that PTSD criteria is getting met, the majority of it, that's what I'm going to be talking about here. So something that's going to cause long-lasting effects to functioning. As we already discussed, traumatic events will bring about those long-lasting effects. So that's what we want to stay focused on. Also, another disclaimer. The following slides are based on my clinical experience and observations. We don't have research on I-CBT and co-occurring OCD and PTSD. The I-CBT content I speak about here is evidence-based, but the interplay between I-CBT and trauma responses is based on my work. So we also don't have concrete research at this time to show us the perfect pathway of treatment for OCD and PTSD cases. We know there is evidence-based treatments for PTSD, and we know there's evidence-based treatments for OCD, including I-CBT, and there isn't an evidence-based treatment path to the perfect solution of co-occurring conditions. So I urge you to use your own clinical judgment when working with these co-occurring diagnoses, and to seek consultation and training as well. And then also follow current research. One name I'm going to throw out there is Dr. Caitlin Penciotti, who does a lot of work in the area of OCD and PTSD cases. She is a gem of a human being as well, but her research is fantastic, and she is happy to share it at any time if you reach out to her. She also has a really great website with resources, so I encourage you all to become her friend, because she is a really smart lady and is doing some good things out there within this population. So I've found I-CBT to be amazing to use when working with OCD and PTSD, or active trauma responsive cases. So often, because of my specialty areas, clients are going to come to treatment with me knowing that they have both trauma and OCD, but they don't always know how they're interacting with each other. And sometimes they haven't labeled some of their symptoms as trauma responses, or they don't see how they are at war within them. So what I've noticed is that finding active trauma responses while focusing on OCD and using I-CBT happens in some common spots along the way. So I'm going to share those with you. And again, remember, I-CBT is not used to treat trauma. What I'm highlighting is how the unique design of I-CBT aids in the identification of possible trauma and how trauma can impact healing with OCD. So this should look familiar to those of you who already know I-CBT. Let's start with Module 2. You may remember that in Module 2, you are helping your clients identify the reasoning behind why they feel they should believe and then act on their obsessional doubt. I say this about every module, but this truly is one of my absolute favorite modules. It is what hooked me on I-CBT from the get-go. I felt so validated as somebody with lived experience that these two wonderful human beings, and Dr. Artema and Dr. O'Connor, actually wanted to hear why I believed these doubts. So this was a big buy-in moment for me. But the facts, rules, hearsay, and personal experience categories here are all used as irrelevant associations in that obsessional reasoning process, the thing that's creating the doubt. So OCD is going to take all of that solid info that the person has, so these things are true on paper, and use it out of context without any direct evidence to support its use in the here and now. And it just so happens that Module 2 is also the perfect place to hear about active trauma responses. And you're going to hear about them here, the personal experience category. Word of caution, though, while anything brought up in this category is going to be a real life event, that doesn't mean the client is experiencing an active trauma response. So don't equate personal experiences with trauma. That's not the case. So don't assume that just because someone has a sexual assault or a car accident in their past, that it means that they're also dealing with an active trauma response now. They might be, but you're going to have to assess and see if that's the case, and listen to your client's knowledge about themselves. Regardless of whether or not there is an active trauma response, the personal experiences you're going to hear about in this module will be used as irrelevant associations in the obsessional reasoning process that's then creating the doubt. So let's say we're working with someone who has the doubt, maybe I hit someone with my car, and they have a past car accident that they mention when you're working here in Module 2, but they do not have an active trauma response going on currently. Maybe they never developed PTSD, or they resolved that response long ago. Your job is to help them see that they're using that personal experience out of context in the here and now. It happened, but that doesn't mean it's relevant information to this moment in time. It has nothing to do with this moment that the client is in right now. So trusting sense data or not in this moment is what makes a possibility relevant or irrelevant in the current context. But for someone who does have an active trauma response due to a car accident, they could have a much harder time accepting that this information isn't relevant to the here and now. And that is where knowing a trauma modality will help you treat any trauma responses that are getting in the way of resolving inferential confusion, resolving that obsessional reasoning process. You are using a trauma treatment to treat a trauma response, so you can then use an OCD treatment like I-CBT to treat the OCD without the trauma interfering. So for those of you who have attended any trainings or consultations with me, you've heard me talk about my OCD openly, but I also have a history of PTSD. And while I don't talk about all aspects of that journey publicly, I feel that real life examples are one of the best ways to teach. So I don't like using my clients' information when being recorded. So I'm going to use some of my own here today. However, some of it's going to be loosely described on later slides. So in my early 20s, a 15-passenger van going northbound on a 4-lane interstate crossed the median and crashed head-on into my southbound compact little car. And a friend happened to be driving my car that night, so I was in the front passenger seat. And it was snowing, and it was really late at night, and I still vividly remember the image of the vehicle in our headlights and knowing we were going to collide. There was absolutely no escape. Like, I knew that this was it. Like, we are going to hit head on. There's no way out. I was knocked unconscious by the impact, but am a testament completely to the use of seatbelts and airbags, which I'm convinced are the absolutely only reason I'm here able to talk to you today. Thankfully, I suffered mostly minor injuries to my body and the loss of my car. But when I regained consciousness, I realized that I had rigid gas permeable hard contact lenses, and those were in. And when this accident happened, they shattered in my eyes when the airbag deployed. Back then, for those of you who are younger, back then many people would actually put these very hard discs of plastic in their eyes. We didn't have all these nice little lovely soft pliable lenses that we have today. Although later I learned from my ophthalmologist that these contact lenses probably saved my vision. I don't know that I would be able to see from this accident if I didn't have those lenses in my eyes, even though these lenses ended up hurting my eyes. So when I got out of the car, I couldn't see clearly at all, not at all. So I stood in the middle of the interstate, bleeding, but attempting to figure out what I needed to do to get help. And I turned to see headlights coming in my direction. And in that moment, I thought I had survived the car accident only to be killed by the cars coming up behind me on the interstate. I thought they were going to slide on the snow and they were going to just run me over. And I panicked, thinking that they couldn't stop in time because of the snow on the ground. So because of the damage to my eyes, I couldn't see that they weren't moving. I hadn't put it all together that, of course, they'd probably been stopped for a long time. I had been knocked unconscious, for instance. So they had time to stop, but I couldn't see that. I just knew that they were there, and they terrified me. And that was a moment that stayed with me for a very long time after this accident. So the people who hit me called 911 so I could get to a hospital. And luckily, an ambulance came upon the scene after a police officer responded. But the EMTs assigned to that ambulance were off duty and refused to transport me to the hospital. So the deputy kind of strong-armed them and told them they had to take me. He wasn't going to wait for another ambulance. And so he basically made them take me. So I'm already in the ambulance with people who didn't want to take me to the hospital. I'm bleeding. I can't see anything. I am panicking. And I tell them that I have these hard contact lenses and they've shattered in my eyes. And they ask me what I want to do about it. Should they flush my eyes out or not? What do they want me to do? And I asked them what they should be doing since they were the medical experts in the vehicle, but they didn't know. And so I told them to just leave me alone. Like, I figured that was probably the best bet. I didn't know, but something in me said, just have them not do anything then if they don't know what they're doing. And we were far away from the hospital, but I tried to hold my eyes very still so I didn't keep cutting them with all these little broken pieces of plastic that were in my eyes. So can you see the messaging I'm getting as I go along in this journey? There's a message that others on the road are unpredictable and that I can't trust others to take care of me, even medical professionals. And that's important because at this time I already had OCD. And my feared possible self is that I will be someone who is negligent. And we'll come back around to that when we talk about module 4 here in a few minutes. But the major message I took away from this is I should have kept this from happening, meaning it was snowing. So I should have just gotten off the road and stayed at a hotel. The accident was my fault, even though I wasn't driving and the driver of the van was truly at fault. It's really, the snow probably was truly at fault. That person did not mean for this to happen, and I don't want to cast blame on them. But my mind blamed me. It was my fault because I wasn't careful enough, and it made me dependent on others when I can't trust others. So I was stupid for not getting off the road when there was an inch of snow, not a ton, despite having grown up where it snows fairly often and people know how to drive in it. So I wasn't cleared to drive for several weeks as my eyes and my body healed and I recovered from the accident. And for the first few days, my eyes were bandaged shut. I wasn't allowed to open them. I was living in absolute terror all the time that I was going blind. I thought for sure I was going to get these bandages off and I wouldn't be able to see. It was terrifying. So when I was finally cleared to drive, it was a few weeks later, and I needed to get back to work. So this is the first time I get back into a car for me to drive. I've been going to doctor's appointments, but being driven because I can't see. So the first time I got into a car to drive, less than 5 minutes into the drive, an oncoming car crosses the center line of a road I was on, crossed the path of the car in front of me and slams into a building next to me, and the car comes back into my path. And this is the first time that I'm cleared to drive after my accident. What are the freaking odds of that? 2 oncoming cars and back-to-back accidents crossing the center line and crashing, one into me, and then thankfully the second time, the other one bouncing back out into traffic in front of me, but my car did not hit. You better believe that all that strengthened the messages I already had gotten about the possibility of freak accidents on roadways, and that it was completely up to me to keep myself safe, and that me even getting in a car at this point was the dumbest thing any human being could ever do because I was being negligent of my safety. Hypervigilance went through the roof, and as you might guess, I developed PTSD after all of this. So cars and anything to do with them were absolutely terrifying to me. And if I'm honest, they aren't my favorite things still today, although my PTSD is treated and I can drive and everything is fine. But if I'm on an interstate, especially if it's snowing, you better believe I'm a little activated at that point. So, but my OCD used this accident within my negligence theme in the formation of doubts such as, did I accidentally hit someone pulling out of my driveway? After all, it's possible. I know that freak accidents can happen. So this criteria A event felt amazingly relevant to every here and now moment in my life that had to do with driving. And while this happened long before I-CBT's manual hit the shelves, if I had been blessed to have been able to access I-CBT at that time, I was so activated within the trauma that seeing the accidents as irrelevant to whether or not I hit someone in my driveway today wouldn't have been impossible, but it would have been much harder to do. So this is an example where pausing to work on trauma content with a trauma modality could benefit your client's I-CBT journey. And I like to call this loosening the traumatic relevancy of the irrelevant association. And again, someone without a traumatic response to an old car accident wouldn't need to do that. But for someone with one, it could be helpful to pendulate into trauma treatment for a bit and then come back to I-CBT. I usually do that after I complete modules 1 through 4, because as you will see, there could still be other traumatic events to uncover that are informing the hold OCD has. So let's take a look at module 3, because here we're asking our clients to identify the narrative that is created through that obsessional reasoning process. And remember that the obsessional reasoning process is our target in I-CBT. It is housed in that narrative, OCD's story, that we capture in module 3, which then concludes in the obsessional doubt that the client becomes aware of and then acts upon. So also known as inferential confusion, it's the thing that is causing someone with OCD to be confused between reality and an imagined possibility, even though there is no direct evidence in the here and now to support that imagined conclusion. So the components of obsessional reasoning that make up the obsessional narrative are over-reliance on possibility, distrust of the senses themselves, and irrelevant associations. We already touched on irrelevant associations in the last few slides about module 2. Those personal traumatic experiences that still hold an active trauma response are going to be very hard to see as irrelevant to the here and now, even though they are when it comes to OCD. But we also have distrust of the senses and self. And you may remember seeing that there are alterations in cognitions in the PTSD criteria. These can be assumptions about the self. I am bad. I should have stopped it. I should have done more. I shouldn't have done this action. I should have seen it coming. The shoulds are signs of toxic shame and self-blame. The person is no longer trusting themselves. Do you remember my takeaway message from those experiences with the cars? It was, I should have kept this from happening. I was no longer trusting myself. The blame was on me. I couldn't trust myself to keep myself safe. I kept making stupid decisions by getting into cars. So negative cognitions associated with traumatic events can feed the distrust of the senses and self and OCD as well. Treating the trauma responses, holding that messaging, makes it a hell of a lot easier to get the trust in the senses and self going in OCD treatment. You may also remember seeing the word hypervigilance under criteria E for arousal and reactivity. Trauma responses often include hypervigilance that is focused on the possibility of the event being repeated. Okay, well, this car accident, I mean, 3 weeks later or whatever it was, here's another event almost identical happening again, right? So think about the hypervigilance that someone needs to be able to live their life after that. Possibility and OCD go hand in hand, right? So having an active trauma response that includes hypervigilance may interfere with this aspect of addressing the obsessional reasoning process. This bad thing did happen, and PTSD trauma response says I need to guard against there being a repeat performance, even though there isn't evidence it's happening again right now. So this sounds like I need to worry about possibility no matter what, because I know bad things are possible. That can look like OCD, but it isn't. It's a trauma response. So trauma isn't causing inferential confusion here. That's a separate process. But inferential confusion is using the trauma to bolster itself. I like to sometimes think of inferential confusion as a little monster. I mean, we know it isn't. It's the obsessional reasoning process. And truly, I like my clients to know that they are creating this like through the obsessional reasoning process. But in light of this, it can be helpful sometimes for you to think about this little monster, right? Who just is cheering when trauma arrives on the scene, because its goal is to confuse possibility with reality. And an active trauma response just makes its job easier. So one final note, since Module 3 is built upon Module 2, don't be surprised if the client may have left out a personal experience in Module 2 and it comes up here in Module 3. In other words, keep listening as the full OCD story comes forward. Another way to see it, OCD's obsessional reasoning process can swoop in and use the traumatic event in response to it as if it is evidence for the creation of the obsessional doubt. But it isn't relevant to the here and now moment of time. So my car accident and the wild events that came after it have nothing to do with the here and now moment when I'm in my car currently driving. And as an example, let's pretend I have a current obsessional doubt of maybe I hit a dog with my car just now. OCD wants to use the trauma response as part of my narrative for the creation of the doubt. Wild accidents have happened to me in the past. They could happen again now. But as I-CBT therapists, we know that still doesn't have anything to do with this moment as I drive. I didn't see a dog running by my car, or I didn't feel my car hit something, or I didn't hear a dog cry out in pain. And again, I cannot stress enough that many yucky things can happen in life that don't need trauma treatment for them. So not every client who comes to your office is going to suddenly need you to do trauma treatment just because they can tell you a story about something bad that happened to them and they're using it in the obsessional reasoning process. I'm going over this for when you know there is an active trauma response going on, high PCL5 or a CAPS-5 score, for instance. Or you uncover something while working with your client and noticing they are really, really stuck on using a past event as a relevant association to the here and now when it isn't. That is when you may need to pull in additional tools. We also have all of the trauma-based toxic shame and self-blame associated with the traumatic event that the OCD can use as evidence for not trusting the self. And finally, the hypervigilance in the aftermath of trauma can make it seem like any wild possibility that can be imagined is possible. After all, many traumas occur in wild or bizarre situations, so that propensity toward imagined hypotheticals can feel even stronger when a trauma response backs up that belief. So maybe I don't see a dog right now, but one could come out of nowhere. So Module 4 is all about finding the feared possible self. And the feared possible self is just another obsessional doubt formed from the same process, but it's turned toward the self and is about who the person fears they are or could become. I have my clients take the feared possible self once we identify it and walk that back through Modules 2 and 3, finding the reasons they believe they could become their feared possible self and identifying the obsessional reasoning process that gets them to that conclusion. And remember that the feared possible self is OCD specific, but underneath that specific obsessional doubt about the self is a wider self theme. People with and without OCD have these. They are made up of things like temperament, attachment issues, traumatic events, and other life events that teach the person something about the self and their interaction with the world. After I get done listening to the feared possible self narrative, I usually ask my clients, when is the first time you remember having to guard against becoming this person? This won't necessarily be related to their OCD onset at all, but it can give you a glimpse into the content that the obsessional reasoning process may be using in the background that they may not be aware of. So this other self-theme stuff that's back there. That information that plays in the background can get hijacked by the OCD and used to support the feared possible self narrative. So irrelevant associations from all these other things, the other aspects of self themes. You don't necessarily need to do anything about these events from the past if the client is able to identify them. Some of them may hold active trauma responses, but many won't. What I find is that most clients don't need to do trauma work around these events. just identifying them gives the client more self-compassion and understanding for possibly why their OCD feared possible self feels believable. It's another layer of demystifying the self-narrative. It gives them insight into a different crossover point in life, the one where they learned something new about their presence in the world. So it's kind of a loss of innocence of sorts. So let's go over an example. My OCD started when I was 15. My mom was told she needed surgery and they thought it was possible she had 3 months to live. So at 15, I thought I was going to lose my mom. This threatened death of a person I relied on and loved was absolutely devastating to me, and OCD just flipped on. So my feared possible self, like I said before, is maybe I could be someone who is negligent. And that theme runs through all of my obsessional doubts. And when I ask myself the question, when is the first time I remember having to guard against becoming negligent, the answer came to my mind immediately. It was from an event when I was very young, but that changed my life overnight. I went from being one way in life to being another. And in that moment, I think I learned that I needed to try to keep things okay for myself and for those around me. Now, this wouldn't have been an OCD response because I didn't have OCD yet. It was a life event that gave me a message about myself and the world. So this isn't my feared possible self. But when my OCD kicked on years later, the obsessional reasoning process that creates that feared possible self uses those irrelevant associations. And because that message that I needed to keep bad things from happening was out there in the fabric of my world already, OCD hijacked it as proof for my feared possible self. If I'm not hypervigilant, then bad things are going to happen. Better not be negligent. You don't want to risk it, that whole kind of thing. And what I find fascinating is that often traumatic responses share similar negative cognitions to the feared possible self. So in case presentations where you have both PTSD and OCD overlap. And it's trickier to untangle. And I don't have research on this. It's purely clinical observation, and it's something to consider. But here is what I mean. So here's a list of self-oriented cognitions I took away from some of the bigger events in my life. For those of you who are here as EMDR therapists, you can start seeing the NC as we go through the negative cognition. The one from when I was young, which was an ending of that little kid innocence, that all is right in the world, that one taught me I need to keep bad things from happening. Then when my mom got sick, all I wanted to do was keep any more bad things from happening. I had a criteria A event after that that included some self-blame and the message, I should have kept this from happening. Then the car accident, same message, right? Later, I lived in Northern Virginia during the DC sniper attacks. For those of you not familiar with that, this was 3 weeks of terror as 2 gunmen shot people as those people went about their days doing everyday activities. So for weeks in the Maryland, DC, and Northern Virginia area, people were afraid to send their children to school or go to work or go to the grocery store. And someone was murdered while getting gas in their car, not terribly far from my office. It was awful. But the message I took away was that I had to keep myself safe in the world because it's unpredictable. I had to increase my vigilance. Then a few years after that, I witnessed someone die in a really horrific accident. And I should have done more to stop it was the message that I took from that. And then the event that affected me most happened to not fit criteria A, but my PCL-5 score was really high and I met other criteria for PTSD again. And the message from that was again that I should have been able to keep it from happening. So do you see how my feared possible self could hook these events as proof that I need to guard against becoming negligent? And again, there isn't any research that I can point to here, but I think this is an interesting phenomenon and may describe why some presentations of OCD and PTSD are trickier to treat than others. The more that feared possible self shares the same message as the traumatic events, the more likely the obsessional reasoning process could loop them in as evidence for the doubt. And when you get an active trauma response looped in, you could see how that could complicate treatment. So in Module 5, we're helping our clients identify obsessional versus reasonable doubt and why sense data is important to that process. And here's where you're going to hear things like, but my common sense tells me that I do need to worry about this. But you are helping your client know that they can rely on their common sense, but then that active trauma response masquerades as common sense. You can see how that might cause a problem. So this is another point where pendulating over to trauma treatment may help loosen that up. With that said, this statement could also be said by someone who just has overvalued ideation and the doubt feels more like a belief. So don't assume that, oh, they said that, now that must mean trauma. It could also just be overvalued ideation. I-CBT has taught me the concept of slowing down, both with my own OCD and as a clinician. You have to slow down in order to get an accurate view of what is in front of you. So if you are a trauma therapist, don't be so quick to assume a trauma response is happening. Not everything is trauma, and OCD treatment needs a different path than trauma treatment. And if you aren't a trauma therapist, don't be so quick to assume there isn't more going on. You may at times need to dig a little deeper. My biggest point is that we can't see clients through one lens. We can be specialists, but we need to be specialists with an openness and curiosity of other areas. Then we have module 6, which is such a powerhouse module. We're teaching our clients that possibility alone isn't a relevant ingredient to reality unless there's direct evidence from the senses that makes it so, that makes it probable to this moment in time. In order for possibility to matter to this moment in time, we have to have trust in the information our senses are bringing to us and be using in-context information. Then we can make a reality-based conclusion. OCD wants to derail this by over-relying on possibility, not trusting the senses and the self, and using irrelevant associations. And trauma can come into play around the importance of possibility and statements like this. But I know bad things can happen. They aren't just possible. They have happened to me. I know they can happen. Possibility does matter. And it doesn't matter if there's an only 0.001% chance it could happen, because wild things have happened to me that didn't have good odds of happening. So with messaging like this from a trauma response, you can see why you might want to address the traumatic event so that your client can see that possibility does need sense data in the here and now in order to be relevant in the current context when it comes to OCD. Last module, you're doing good. Hang in there. And module 7, you are talking about the bubble and the experience of it. You are helping your clients learn that going further into the bubble makes them less secure and that leaving it is an option. So I like to make sure my clients do some exercises around noticing that stories can bring on truly terrifying real emotions, even though the story itself is false. This is what OCD does, brings on real feelings around irrelevant narratives. So how can trauma come up here? Well, if the OCD story that your client is getting pulled into within the bubble is using an active trauma response as leverage to support it, then there's a chance that the client is in two bubbles at once, the OCD bubble and the trauma bubble. Trauma responses can make the OCD bubble feel even more real, and OCD bringing up content related to the trauma can trigger a trauma response. So you have to sort out what is what. And if the client is using any active trauma to support the feared possible self narrative, that self-blame around the trauma event that backs up that feared possible self, then choosing to accept what the senses are saying and move into reality may be hard to do. OCD will convince the person that they are choosing to be their feared possible self by not doing the compulsions to keep the bad things from happening. The bad things, like that event that is keeping an active trauma response going on right now. So I want to wrap up so we have a few minutes for questions. There is so much to say, but an hour is just not enough time, and I'm sure I've already overwhelmed you all anyway. So this talk is by no means meant to cover everything regarding OCD and PTSD, but I hope it's giving you some things to consider and a bit of direction. And if your head's spinning, here are some things I hope you'll consider as we end this talk. So OCD and PTSD symptoms can seem similar. Pinpoint which condition is causing the symptoms so accurate treatment can be given. Listen for traumatic responses throughout the I-CBT modules. Watch for trauma hijacking the resolution of obsessional doubt. Keep an eye on research because it'll keep coming, thankfully. And not every bad event is causing PTSD or active trauma responses. Remember that the majority of OCD cases you treat will not meet OCD and PTSD criteria, but odds are you will encounter clients that do, and you will encounter clients that don't meet full PTSD criteria, but have an active trauma responses affecting functioning and meet all other non-criteria A factors. Obviously, I was one of those sufferers with OCD and PTSD, so I am truly grateful to you for spending time with me today, because I-CBT is a powerful and beautiful tool. I feel like I'm in a dance with it every day when I'm using it. I just love it so much. And I don't know about all of you, but I feel more competent and effective as a clinician when I can slow down, really look at symptoms along with my clients, and find the right tool to use to help them. So one of the biggest things I have taken away from I-CBT is a better understanding of how to pinpoint OCD. It then allows me to take a fresh look at anything OCD adjacent that isn't created through the obsessional reasoning process. And then I can find the right tool or specialist to help with that as well. Trauma and PTSD are possibly going to be one of those OCD adjacent things you encounter. So thank you for sharing space here with me and listening to both my personal and clinical viewpoints. And I hope that another person suffering from OCD and PTSD will benefit through the work that you do. So thank you for showing up for people with OCD and PTSD, because it's really important work. All right. That's it. Did I break everyone's brains?
Thank you so very much, Bronwyn. That was, yeah, a robust presentation for sure.
Told ya.
A great starting point for a lot of us. So I really, really appreciate it. There's all kinds of thank yous coming into the chat. I'm not going to read them all, but I can send them to you later if you would like.
Sure.
As far as questions, there was a question about whether slides would be available. So I don't know if you are willing
These
to
are
share slides.
going to be a part of a bigger training with OCD training school. So the answer to that one's probably no, but people can always reach out to me if they need a certain something.
Sure.
So.
That was my question was, did you say that bigger training is in the process of being created?
Yeah.
Okay, great. We will
Yep.
look forward to that. And then I will invite other people to raise their hand and ask any questions or share comments that you would like. I did not see any specific questions come into the chat. So if I missed any, you'll need to raise your hand because I didn't see it. Christina, can you unmute and then ask your question?
Yeah, thank you so much, Bronwyn. This presentation was incredibly helpful, incredibly informative, and so relevant to the clinical work that I do. And I'm in the process, I'm newer to I-CBT, and I'm in the process of really honing in my skills and wrapping my mind around it and using it. Is there going to be an opportunity to have more of like an open discussion on these Friday meetings to talk about PTSD and OCD and the overlap?
So one of my dreams right now is to do like a more open OCD, PTSD, like monthly meeting or something where we can get together and just chat about topics for free. And then also just, more information about this. But, Dr. Pinciotti's work is really good. And I think we could easily just spend time going through those documents together and really talking about research. And I have a very big dream of having a completed I-CBT clinician, like I-CBT and PTSD trauma therapy directory, because I get asked for people all the time asking me, where can I go to find somebody who will do I-CBT with me, but also knows trauma? And I don't have good answers. So that's another aspect of mine that I really want to put together. So yeah, maybe I'll just look at my calendar and we'll start a monthly meeting. We can start looking at research together and chat, and that could be a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anybody else? I'm kind of an open book, guys. You can ask anything.
Angie Henry is dropping a question in the chat. Does the work change from kids to adults? For example, perhaps an adolescent who is not saying it's trauma, but behaviors that safeguard against the traumatic event happening again.
Yeah, and you don't, clients don't have to name it either as trauma. You can just talk about it as an event that happened that's bringing up these kinds of symptoms. So I would, behavior speaks. And so I would look at behavior and notice what that is going back to. I mean, the function of behavior is a strong indicator of these things. So going through a screener with them, you don't want to just rely just based on your judgment. Like actually take some time, learn the PCL5, learn the CAPS5, go through and actually do an assessment and see what you think is there. And I could talk to you guys forever about how to incorporate parts work and different trauma modalities. And I mean, there's so much to this work that I seriously could not put in an hour presentation. I already feel like there was too much in there, but there's a lot to be learned here. And we're at baby steps on learning how to really help people with this. So it really is amazing that you guys are all here and listening. Yeah, parts work's good. Anybody else? Amy's question is, do you see a particular trauma modality works well with I-CBT? I mean, my background is EMDR. I think it works really nicely with I-CBT for a whole numerous amount of reasons. But, you have to be careful with doing things with exposure because you don't want to trigger anything where we're doing stuff like that with OCD. And but I would say that most likely any of these are going to be fine to do. As long as it's an evidence-based modality, I would dive into it and see. And written exposure therapy is super intriguing, you all, because it's 5 sessions and really interesting. The research on it is really strong. It's showing that it's non-inferior to CPT, which is way longer. So if you want to pick up a trauma modality and you don't want to spend thousands of dollars or tons of time, I would encourage you to look at written exposure therapy. You can buy the book online, attend an online training. It's an interesting one. It's written exposure therapy.
I have a question, Bronwyn.
Yes,
so let's say that when you are writing when you go to module 2 and you discover trauma, let's say, or when you do your initial assessment and you discover trauma and you decide to tackle, one question would be, what do you treat first?
Mm-hmm.
That would be one question that I have. And the other question is, if you are, let's say if you decide to treat OCD because the level, whatever it is higher, or whatever that decision led you to, and you start working with I-CBT, do you pause in some moment, like in module 4 maybe, and then start treat trauma and then you come back? Or is there something that you postpone? I'm just curious about how you instrument that.
You're going to hate my answer because it's dependent on the client, their wishes, as well as clinical judgment on what I think is the best path forward. So I know that's a gray answer, but typically I'm going to look at, okay, we're going to look at the symptoms. We're going to try to figure out OCD or PTSD. Which one of these feels more urgent to you? Which one's causing you the most distress now? Do we want to start there? If we end up starting with OCD, I do usually go through modules 1 through 4, and then we'll pause and pendulate back into trauma treatment. Sometimes we're doing this, concurrently, where we're doing a little bit of I-CBT work, and then I'll spend the rest of the session on a trauma. Or I am doing alternating, like where one session we're working on PTSD work, the next session we're now going to see how we can apply that within the OCD context. It just kind of depends on where we are in the modules and where they are in treatment. But I do let my clients be my guide as much as possible, because if they aren't ready to work on a traumatic event, then I'm not going to ever push someone to do that. So we have to allow them to have a say within that, 3-pronged approach: evidence-based treatment, clinical judgment, and client. Yep.
Thank you.
Welcome. Anybody else?
Okay, I'm going to go ahead, since we are at the top of the hour. I will end the recording, and I really, really want to thank you one more time, Bronwyn. The recording will be eventually posted on the I-CBT online webpage and on the YouTube channel, but then we'll still hang out for a few minutes after I stop the recording in case there are any lingering questions.